Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. Jada's trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG on the YouTube.com. Down there, we like magic. And a few days ago, I showed you $10 mono blue junk rares. You haven't seen it yet? Check the description for the link. But in that video, I asked you if you'd want to see more of this bulk rares concept. And the answer was a huge yes. Many of you told me that you want to see this with all 5 colors. So, flash forward to yesterday's deck tech. I asked you which color you'd want to see most next, and black was in the running for a while. You guys seem to want to see that too, but red really ran away with it. Let's get hyped for $10 mono red bulk rares. That's cool. This deck has actually been through a fair amount of evolution. You know, at first I was just playing an aggro deck. We're going like turn 1 Falcon Wrath Gorger, turn 2 Kari Zev, or even Scourge Wolf. That was weird, but it's available to play. Turn 3, we'd play a haste guy, either Lathnu Hellion or Gaia Reach Bandit. Turn 4, we'd play another haste guy, either Gold Knight Castigator or Impetuous Devils. I mean, it was a fun, decent little aggro deck, but it's kind of boring, you know, and I've already done a mono red aggro deck when Amonkhet came out. I just did a big red deck, and like Seth on MTG Goldfish just did like 2 ticks mono red the other day. So like, I've seen a lot of mono red aggro lately here on the YouTube, and it's getting a little boring. And honestly, I just hated playing creatures on curve because that's what I've been doing for a while. I wanted to switch it up, and the end product here of that goal is something really weird that plays a lot of really fun, super cool cards. Like a lot of the cards in this deck have little cult followings. A lot of people in certain sects of the Magic community really like a lot of these rares here today, and we're playing 25 of them between the main deck and the sideboard. And just like the blue deck, it's only going to be $10 when we check out on TCG Players. So let me show you this weird deck. Ultimately, I decided to build this deck around a super fun card that I've been asked to do a deck about a few times, but never actually really have, and that is Harness the Storm, which we're going to play a whole 4 copies of. Here's a cool little value engine right here that's only like 15 cents on TCG Player right now. That is a steal for something that we can build an entire deck around from the top down and play a bunch of cool rares and stuff too, along with this already amazingly cool card. Now, before I go any further, I realize that a lot of people haven't seen or played with this card in a long time, and a lot of you may have never actually even seen the card before or completely forgotten about it. So I think a quick primer on Harness the Storm is in order here. First thing I want to point out about the card is that the card that you cast from your graveyard with Harness the Storm doesn't go into exile or anything. It just goes straight back into your graveyard after it resolves. And another important thing to remember is that the card you're casting from your graveyard resolves before the card that you cast from your hand. That's sometimes pretty important. We'll talk about it later on in the video, actually. Another note is that when you cast the card out of your graveyard, you can pay alternative costs for the card, like Surge, which will play somewhat of a part in this deck. But if you've got any other alternate costs and whatever you're building with Harness the Storm, like Kicker is another good example, you can pay those alternate costs when you cast the card. Also, one of the more basic things to remember is that you still have to pay the cost for the card that you're casting out of your graveyard. If you cast a 2-mana card out of your hand, and you want to cast that same card out of your yard, you got to pay another 2 mana. Important to remember. Another quick important thing to remember is that if a card requires additional costs like Tormenting Voice or Lightning Axe, which requires you to discard cards, then you'll still have to do that. If you cast a Lightning Axe out of your yard, still have to discard. Not going to matter in this version of the deck, but it might matter in whatever version you build. And a final note here, I just want to point out that Harness the Storm says when you cast an instant or sorcery from your hand, specifically, then it triggers Harness the Storm. So it won't work with things like Goblin Dark-Dwellers or Aftermath cards that you cast out of your graveyard. Now that all that's out of the way, isn't Harness the Storm a super stupid cool card? I've always wanted to do something with this thing, you know. It can make even a lowly shock deal like 4 damage for just a couple of mana. That's great, and it works really well with all the other stuff we're playing in the deck, even if things get a little pricey, like we're playing Collective Defiance in the deck, and it costs a whole 6 mana to cast one out of your hand and one out of your yard, and even more if you want to escalate either one of them. But it's still pretty cool when you do have 6 mana to be able to, like, rip somebody for 6 or whatever. That's pretty sweet. Before I get into all the instants and sorceries and stuff that we can abuse Harness the Storm with, I'm going to go ahead and tell you about the very limited number of creatures that we're playing in the deck, you know. First of all, again, we're trying to get some value out of Harness the Storm, so we don't have too many slots for creatures, and we've got some stuff in the deck that wheels our hand. I've already mentioned Collective Defiance, and we got another thing. So if we do dump creatures into our yard with those cards that wheel our hand, there's really no way to get them back. So I don't want to run that risk too often, but there are some creatures that I think are definitely good enough to play in this deck, starting with the 2 copies of Goblin Dark-Dwellers. Now, Dark-Dwellers only has about 12 targets that it can really hit in this deck, but that is more than enough to play just a couple of copies. And we're going to use the early game to play instants and sorceries for the most part, so by the time we get to Goblin Dark-Dwellers, it should easily have a target. Dark-Dwellers is also just like a big threat that's just in their face and slightly hard to block, especially considering we're picking off guys like all game, and Goblin Dark-Dwellers usually kills a creature when it enters the battlefield. It's theoretically hard for them to block a guy that has menace when you've been killing their guys all game. Also, one more time, we're playing some stuff in the deck that allows us to wheel our hand. We dump our hand in our graveyard and draw that many cards, in case you're not familiar with that terminology. But we'll be dumping instants and sorceries into our graveyard from time to time, and so we can just drop them in there. Goblin Dark-Dwellers can cast them once they're in our graveyard. So it's like we didn't lose the card to begin with. That's kind of cool. We're also going to play 3 copies of Sin Prodder, who I like a lot in this deck. He synergizes a good bit with what we're trying to do with Harness the Storm. If you have a Sin Prodder out, and a Harness the Storm for that matter, then whenever you go to either get your card during your upkeep, or maybe your opponent decides to put it in your graveyard, it's kind of a win-win either way. If your opponent puts an instant or sorcery in our graveyard, then when we draw another copy of it, then we can just cast the copy that's in our graveyard. That's pretty cool. Or if they let us put cards in our hand, then they're just giving us card advantage, which we really want in this deck. So Sin Prodder is super sweet if not removed, and it's a threat. And Sin Prodder's cool. Like, I've done a bunch of mono red decks that I didn't think Sin Prodder was quite good enough for, and I always get it in the comments section for not including him. People love Sin Prodder, and so do I, truth be told. I just don't know if he's strong enough for certain, like, really high-end decks, but for what we're trying to do here, he synergizes really, really well, and it's just a good card in his own right. And to finish off the creatures, one of the few non-rare cards in the whole deck here, we're going to play 4 copies of Thermo-Alchemist because he's really good with Harness the Storm. Getting extra triggers off of Harness the Storm makes an already sweet card like Alchemist even better. Getting double triggers whenever we decide to use Harness the Storm's trigger is freaking, it's just ridiculous. We can just deal all the damage in the world with a Thermo-Alchemist in this deck. And even if we don't have a Harness the Storm, we've still got like 23 instants or sorceries in this deck that Alchemist can work off of, so sometimes they'll just deal like 5 or 6 or more damage for you over the course of the game. And as we all know by now, getting multiple Alchemists is super sick. But now into the spells here, and I'm going to show you the other non-rare cards that we're playing in the main deck. Every other card after these will be rare, but we're going to go ahead and play 4 copies of Shock and 4 copies of Galvanic Bombardment in the deck. Now, Harness the Storm can get pricey, so we want to play as many of these 1-cost spells as we possibly can. That way, we can just eke out as much value as possible for 2 mana. And both of these are pretty nice. I've already mentioned Shock can deal 4 damage for just 2 mana if you've got one in your graveyard when you cast one and a Harness the Storm out. 4 damage for 2 mana is no joke, and you can like pick a guy off and hit them to the dome for 2, or you can just kill a guy that has 4 toughness. Like, there's lots of versatile ways that you can use Shock with a Harness of Storm, but it's still kind of a fine card without Harness of Storm. You can dome guys, you can pick off small dudes in the early game, zombies and such. So, like, still a fine card either way. But Galvanic Bombardment deserves certain special attention. I told you earlier, during the primer for Harness the Storm, that the card you cast out of your graveyard will resolve first before the card that you cast out of your hand. Let's just say, for instance, that I have a Harness the Storm out. I have a Galvanic Bombardment in my graveyard, and I have one in my hand. If I cast the one from my hand, here's what will happen. First, we'll cast Galvanic Bombardment out of our hand, and then Harness the Storm's trigger will go on the stack. Follow me up till now. Then, we can cast the Galvanic Bombardment out of our graveyard. It moves from our graveyard to the stack, completely different zone. When it resolves, which it will resolve first before the one you cast from your hand, when the one from your graveyard resolves, it will not see itself in the graveyard. It obviously won't see the one you cast from your hand in your graveyard, so it'll just do 2 damage. Go back to the graveyard. Then the one you cast from your hand will resolve, see the Galvanic Bombardment in the graveyard that you just cast, and deal 3 damage. I know that sounds like a lot, but basically you'll deal 5 damage off of Galvanic Bombardment in this situation. Have fun explaining that, but it's a really, really powerful interaction to have. We can deal 5 damage to a guy for just 2 mana. That's really good, and obviously, if we have multiple bombardments in our graveyard when we do this, we can deal even more damage to a guy. Just a couple of damage, or a couple of mana, will take out almost any creature in the format. So, it's a really, really nice thing to be able to do. Galvanic Bombardment is made into one of the better cards that we could possibly play in the deck, because Harness the Storm works so well with it. We're going to play 4 Insult to Injury in this deck. Yeah, totally, all 4. We're going to do it. Insult to Injury is super sweet in this deck for a few reasons. First of all, I just want to clear this up. If you do cast 2 injuries in one turn via Harness the Storm, for instance, then things that you cast will then deal 4 times the damage. So if you cast 1 shock after that, it'll deal 8 damage. If you manage to cast 2 shocks after that, by the way, you are dealing 16 damage. For 8 mana, yes, that's a lot of mana, but it's probably worth it to deal. That's about as much as you'd have to pay to deal 16 damage, I think. So it's a very worthwhile interaction to point out. Another thing to point out, again, I think this is the 3rd or 4th time, is that we are wheeling our hand in this deck. So if we drop an Insult to Injury into our graveyard, not all is lost. We can still cast the Injury half, which is pretty sweet. Also, just want to point this out. You can, if you cast an Insult out of your hand, cast Injury out of the graveyard due to Harness the Storm's trigger. There's not really a whole lot of benefit in doing that. You could have just cast the Injury out of your graveyard regardless, but it's worth clearing up that you can do that if the mood strikes you. It's possible, at least. Also, while we're clearing up rule stuff here, you cannot target Insult with Goblin Dark-Dwellers. That kind of hurts a lot, you know. I really like to be able to target Insult and cast Injury with Goblin Dark-Dwellers. That would be even sweeter, but alas, we cannot do that, so don't try. We're going to play 4 copies of Collective Defiance in the deck, yes, all day, and this is the most expensive card that I will allow myself to put in this deck. It is much more expensive than all the other stuff. Everything else costs less than 50 cents, but this card is about 85 cents right now, but I definitely think it's worth playing because it's super sweet with both Harness the Storm and Goblin Dark-Dwellers. And I love the choice that Harness the Storm gives us with Collective Defiance. If we do have the 6 mana required to play it out of our hand and our graveyard off of Harness the Storm, then we can deal like 3 to the dome twice. We can deal 4 to 2 guys. We can hit a creature for 4. We can hit them in the dome for 3. We can hit them in the dome for 3 and wheel our hand. Whatever we want to do. We've got a world of options open for just 6 mana. Sounds like a lot, but it's actually not that bad, especially considering just 6 mana can sometimes finish the game. If you're able to cast 2 Collective Defiance and just dome for 6, that's not bad. That can finish things. We're going to play 3 copies of Fall of the Titans in the deck. This is the Surge card that I was talking about earlier. First of all, a trick that you will probably perform a few times is just casting a Fall of the Titans for 0 out of your hand, just paying 1 red mana for it, and casting the Fall of the Titans in your graveyard for its Surge cost. That's a pretty hot trick. Of course, if you had all the mana in the world, you could always increase the number of targets that you'll be able to hit with this by like pumping a few mana into the first one and then casting the one with Surge for like 3 or 4. That would cost a bunch of mana, but if you had it, you could technically do it. So notice how many like really late game, all the mana in the world win options we have. Just like auto win, deal 16 to you, or auto win, deal 8 to you, or whatever, you know. We've got the mana to do it. We've got a lot of insane late game options. In the last spell in the deck, I'm particularly excited about this one because we get to play 3 copies of Fateful Showdown. It's so awesome. Fateful Showdown is great. Even if you don't have a full grip of cards when you cast it, you know. Even if you just have 3-4 cards in your hand, it's sometimes okay to zap a guy for 3 at instant speed or dome them for 3 at instant speed. All that's kind of good, but sometimes you will have a full grip or like 5 or 6, and then you're doing some real damage. And this is another way, by the way, with Harness the Storm, that if you have all of the mana, if you have like 8 mana, you can cast Fateful Showdown out of your hand, then cast it out of your graveyard, deal 4 or 5 with the one out of your graveyard, another 4 or 5 with the one out of your hand, and suddenly you won the game because you just did 10 damage. Again, takes a lot of mana, but we've got like a million ways in this deck to completely demolish them if we get to all of our mana. We get to 8-9 mana. We're going to win the game a lot of the time, and we've got stuff like Shock, Galvanic Bombardment, Collective Defiance to sort of hold down the early game for us. So it's not unheard of that we get to 8 mana in this deck and actually get to Fateful Showdown twice. And even if you don't kill them outright with that, it's still a ridiculously great play. And yeah, you got to wheel your hand twice, whatever. You're still dealing so much damage. And one more thing, because I just don't want to be done talking quite yet. This is instant speed. You can just like hit your opponent in the face at the end of their turn for like 6. It's totally possible. And being able to wheel your hand at instant speed is sweet too. Here are the lands in the deck. They are significantly less exciting than Fateful Showdown or Harness the Storm. We're just playing 25 mountains because I want to keep it simple. Just kiss it. Keep it simple, stupid. You know, I don't see any reason to play a bunch of crazy lands or anything. The 25 mountains will do the job. And a final note, by the way, on the lands, 25 is right, I think. This is a really, really mana-hungry deck. I've already talked about how some of the things we want to do with Harness the Storm will cost like 8 mana sometimes. So we want all of our mana, even if we're just trying to double up on Collective Defiance. That still costs 6, so we need all of our drops. Here's a sideboard for you right here. I think 4-of Magma Spray is pretty much no-brainer. That's in every deck that carries red, so we'll do that. Blazing Volley is great against token stacks and decks that play smaller guys and stuff. And it's really great to double up on with Harness the Storm if we're playing against zombies or energy or any deck like that with small guys, just a couple of toughness apiece. Then doubling up on Blazing Volley for just 2 mana is a board wipe in some cases, so that's awesome. Lightning Weaver can give us a little bit of extra reach to take out bigger guys. We're casting a lot of direct damage in the deck, and Lightning Weaver is actually fairly impressive sometimes, so we'll play the 3 copies. Structural Distortion is in there because it's great. It's great. I'm playing this over anything like by force, or Release the Gremlins is a little too expensive for us in this deck, but playing this over by force because it's much better when you can copy it. But even if you can't, it still takes out Heart of Kiran, Aetherworks Marvel, Scrap Heap Scrounger, everything in between, and can hit for as much as 4 if you're able to copy it. That's nothing to sneeze at. And finally, we'll finish off the playset of Sin Prodder against decks where we want to force that decision on our opponent. Mostly against control. If we can resolve a Sin Prodder and they can't do anything about it right away, it can cause some headaches. They're either going to take a few damage off of it, or they're going to give you card advantage that they really don't want to give you. By the way, while I'm on Sin Prodder, and before I get to the power rankings here, I'm just going to throw this out. Sin Prodder is actually really interesting synergy with Fateful Showdown. You know, Showdown makes us have cards in our hand before it does any substantial damage, and Sin Prodder can put cards in our hand. Hey, look at that. You know, once our opponent knows about this interaction, they'll probably want to force us to put the cards in our yard, but again, they're still taking damage, and we can still cast them again once we draw another copy of them, and we have a Harness the Storm out. So Sin Prodder is not only good with Harness the Storm, it's also super great with Fateful Showdown. Here's your power rankings right here. A final score of 55, which is pretty respectable for just $10. Mid-50s is pretty much where we're looking to be. Yeah. But speed is low because, again, we got to get to so much mana before we're doing, like, any of the really, really dirty stuff in this deck. But even if you're just copying Shock or casting Shock twice off of Harness the Storm, you're still doing some pretty dirty stuff. But to do the really filthy, nasty things, you need a bunch of mana, so our speed isn't very high. Just under $10 is a steal for this deck. You can do so much for cheap with mono red right now. I already had a mono red $10 deck that played a bunch of rare creatures and stuff. Now this super weird, almost combo sort of deck is only $10. For just like $15, you can build a really good mono red aggro deck. So like, honestly, like, red has a lot of great lower end stuff going for it right now. And if you wanted to upgrade the deck, there's a bunch of like uncommons I didn't play because they're too expensive. Harness Lightning would be pretty good because it could take out a couple of guys for 4 mana and give you 6 whole energy. That'd be sweet if you're trying to do other stuff with energy, you know. And Incendiary Flow is obviously a great choice for the deck, which I would have played all day if I allowed myself to play dollar uncommons in the deck, but I felt like that flew in the face of playing 25-cent rares. So I didn't allow myself to play Incendiary Flow, but if you've got them or you had the $4 to get the playset, they'd definitely be the first thing that goes in. But I'm tapped out for this one. That's all I've got for now. Let me know how you felt about this deck in the comments section. This deck is a blast to play, and it was a blast to build too, so give it a shot. Let me know how you felt about it, and let me know how you did with it, and let me know what you'd put in the deck if you wanted to upgrade it or side grade it even. You know, what's some stuff I didn't include that's relatively cheap that you think could go in this? Interested in hearing all of your thoughts on this deck in the comments section. And what are we doing next time? Well, until Hour of Devastation spoilers start, I just kind of want to finish up this series. You know what I mean? I'm having a lot of fun building and messing around with these decks. So let me know which color you'd want to see next in the $10 bulk rares series. We've already done blue and obviously red, so those are out. So between black, green, and white, which one do you want to see next? If last time is any indication, I think it'll be black, but I actually think that green has a case to make for bulk rares. So let me know which one you want to see next time. And that's it for now. Like the video if you like the video. I can't stress that enough. It puts it in people's recommended feeds. That helps the channel a lot. So please like the video if you can. You can also go to Patreon if you can. Check out patreon.com/SBMTG and follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. And as usual, as always, thanks for watching, my wizards.